The morning sun hadn't even risen when Marcus Johnson woke up to the familiar sound of his mom getting ready for her early shift at Joe's Diner. Through the thin walls of their small house, he could hear her humming softly. She always hummed when she was trying to stay positive, even when things were tough. Marcus sat up in his narrow bed, the springs creaking under him. His room was small but neat. Basketball posters covered the cracks in the walls, and a shelf held his most prized possessions. 3 worn basketball trophies from middle school, some dog-eared library books about famous athletes, and a framed photo of him and his mom at his middle school graduation. She was wearing her nicest dress that day, the blue one she saved for special occasions. "Marcus, baby, you up?" his mom called softly. "Don't forget to eat breakfast before school." "Yes, Mama," he replied, already pulling on his jeans. They were a little short at the ankles. He'd grown 2 inches this summer, and new clothes weren't in the budget yet. In the kitchen, his mom was putting on her white diner uniform, the one she'd ironed late last night. Sarah Johnson was a beautiful woman, even with tired lines around her eyes. She worked 2 jobs, mornings at the diner and evenings cleaning offices, but Marcus never heard her complain. "There's cereal in the cabinet," she said, pinning her name tag to her uniform. "And I made you a sandwich for lunch. Peanut butter today." "Sorry, baby. It's what we had." "That's fine, Mama. Peanut butter's good." Marcus smiled, not letting her see his worry about how empty their kitchen cabinets were getting. He knew payday wasn't until next week. His mom came over and straightened his t-shirt collar, a habit she'd had since he was little. "You're getting so tall," she said proudly, "just like your daddy was." Marcus didn't remember his father. He'd died in a construction accident when Marcus was just 2. All he had was one photo and his mom's stories about how tall and kind his father had been. "Now remember," she continued, grabbing her purse, "head straight to school, then basketball practice after. No stopping anywhere else. This town." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Some people still have old ways of thinking. Best to keep your head down and focus on your future." Marcus nodded. At 16, he knew exactly what she meant. Being one of the few black families in their small Georgia town wasn't easy, but his mom always said education was their ticket to something better. After his mom left, Marcus ate his cereal slowly, watching the sunrise through their kitchen window. The neighbor's cat, an orange tabby named Rusty, sat on their windowsill looking in. Marcus sometimes shared his milk with Rusty when no one was looking. The walk to Mountain View High School took exactly 22 minutes if he didn't rush. Marcus liked to leave early, avoiding the morning traffic of fancy cars driven by kids whose parents could afford such things. His worn sneakers made soft sounds on the sidewalk as he walked, carrying his backpack and a basketball that had seen better days. The town was waking up around him. Mr. Chen was opening his grocery store, arranging fruit outside like he did every morning. He waved at Marcus, sometimes giving him an apple or orange that was too ripe to sell, but perfectly good to eat. Today, he called Marcus over. "Basketball star, come here." Mr. Chen smiled, his accent thick but warm. "Take orange. Good for energy." Marcus started to politely refuse, but Mr. Chen was already pressing a large orange into his hand. "Your mother, she good customer. Always honest when I give too much change. Good people deserve good things." "Thank you, Mr. Chen," Marcus said, carefully putting the orange in his backpack. He'd share it with his mom later. As he walked on, Marcus passed the town's better neighborhoods. Houses got bigger, yards got greener, and cars got shinier. Some people working in their gardens would look up as he passed. A few nodded politely. Others quickly looked away or watched him suspiciously until he was past their property. Marcus kept walking, his basketball tucked under his arm. His mom always said, "Keep your head high but your eyes forward." So that's what he did. The school parking lot was starting to fill up when he arrived. Brandon Miller's red sports car was already in its usual spot, front row, where everyone could see it. Brandon was the quarterback. the most popular guy in school, and never let anyone forget his father owned half the real estate in town. Marcus headed for the side entrance, the one fewer people used. But before he could reach it, he heard tires screeching behind him. A black Mercedes pulled up, stopping suddenly. "Hey, Johnson." It was Brandon, leaning out his car window. "Nice shoes. My gardener has the same pair." Some kids nearby laughed. Marcus kept walking, his face burning but his steps steady. "What's wrong?" "Can't take a joke." Brandon called after him. "Maybe if your mom worked a few more jobs, you could afford some real shoes." Marcus's hand tightened on his basketball, but he remembered his mom's words. Your future is bigger than their words. He pushed through the side door and headed to his locker. The hallways were filling up with students, their voices echoing off the metal lockers. Marcus stopped at his locker, number 244, dented but still working. Inside, he had his books neatly arranged, along with a small mirror his mom had given him. "To remind you of who you are," she'd said. "A king in the making." First period was English with Mrs. Davis, one of the few teachers who seemed to really see Marcus. She was young, maybe in her late 20s, and didn't care about whose parents owned what or where anyone lived. "Today," she announced, "we're starting To Kill a Mockingbird. Can anyone tell me what they know about this book?" Marcus knew the book well. He'd read it last summer, sitting on their small porch while his mom was at work, but he kept his hand down. Sometimes it was better not to stand out. Continuing the story, developing Marcus's character, his daily challenges, and the subtle dynamics of his life in this small town. Would you like me to continue with the next section? The story will continue building the foundation of Marcus's world, his relationships, and the underlying tensions that will drive the narrative forward. Would you like me to proceed with the next part to reach the full word count you requested? I'll maintain this same simple vocabulary and detailed storytelling style while continuing to build the opening setup of the story. Just let me know if you'd like any adjustments to the style, pacing, or level of detail so far. Marcus sat at his old wooden desk, staring at the torn basketball poster on his wall. The morning sun peeked through his window's cracked blinds, making lines of light dance across his homework from last night. His mom had already left for her early shift at Joe's Diner, leaving a small note saying, "I love you," next to the cereal bowl. The walk to school was always the same, 20 minutes of trying to avoid the holes in his sneakers hitting puddles. Other kids drove past in their shiny cars, some not even looking his way. Marcus didn't mind, though. He had bigger dreams than fancy cars. He wanted to make it to college, to show everyone in this small town that he was more than what they thought. When he got to Mountain View High School, the usual scene played out. The rich kids gathered near their parking spots, laughing and showing off their new phones. Marcus walked past them, head high but eyes forward. He'd learned that was the best way to avoid trouble. Well, if it isn't the charity case," came a voice that made Marcus's shoulders tense. Brandon Miller, the school's star quarterback and son of the town's biggest real estate developer, stood blocking the entrance. His perfectly white teeth showed in what looked like a smile but felt more like a threat. "Just trying to get to class, Brandon," Marcus said quietly, trying to move past. Brandon shifted, making sure to bump Marcus's shoulder hard. "Heard you got an A on Thompson's math test. You must be cheating. No way someone from your neighborhood's that smart." A small crowd started gathering. Some looked uncomfortable, but nobody said anything. They never did. "I studied hard for that test," Marcus replied, his voice steady, even though his heart was racing. "Just like everyone else." "Yeah, right," Brandon sneered. "Bet you can't even afford a calculator. Probably stole one." Marcus felt heat rising in his neck, but his mom's words echoed in his head. "Don't let them see they got to you. That's what they want." Just then, Mrs. Thompson, the math teacher, walked up. She was a small woman with gray hair and kind eyes. But today they weren't so kind as she looked at Brandon. "Mr. Miller," she said sharply, "Marcus earned that A through hard work, something you might want to try sometime." Now, all of you, get to class." The crowd broke up, but Brandon wasn't done. "This isn't over," he whispered as he passed Marcus. "Nobody makes me look bad." In first period English, Marcus tried to focus on "To Kill a Mockingbird," but his mind kept drifting. He thought about how his mom worked double shifts just to keep food on the table, about how she'd never gone to college, but made sure he knew he could, about how she taught him to be proud but careful, strong but smart. Sarah Chen, who sat next to him, passed him a note. "Don't let Brandon get to you. He's just jealous because you're actually going somewhere." Marcus smiled slightly. Sarah was one of the few kids at school who didn't care about where someone came from. Her parents owned the local Chinese restaurant, and she knew what it was like to be different. The morning classes went by slowly. In history, they were studying the civil rights movement. Marcus felt everyone glance his way when they talked about segregation, like he was some kind of living museum exhibit. He kept his eyes on his notebook, drawing small basketball plays in the margins. At lunch, Marcus sat at his usual table near the back of the cafeteria. He unpacked the sandwich his mom had made. Peanut butter again, but he didn't mind. Some days, when tips were good, she'd slip in a candy bar. Today wasn't one of those days. Brandon's voice carried across the cafeteria. "Bet he's on food stamps. Probably doesn't even have real food at home." A few people laughed, but Marcus noticed some looked away, embarrassed. He took another bite of his sandwich, pretending he couldn't hear. But each word felt like a small cut. Coach Wilson stopped by his table. The old basketball coach had been watching Marcus play since middle school. "Hey son," he said quietly, "you coming to practice today?" "Yes, sir," Marcus answered. Basketball practice was the best part of his day. "Good. Got some college scouts coming next week. Think they might be interested in seeing what you can do." Marcus's heart jumped, but he kept his face calm. "Really?" Coach Wilson nodded. "You've got talent, son. Real talent. Don't let anyone tell you different." The autumn wind blew cold against Marcus's face as he walked home from basketball practice. His muscles ached from the extra drills Coach Wilson had him doing. The sun was already setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Marcus pulled his thin jacket tighter around his shoulders, wishing he had a warmer one. As he passed the town's main street, he saw Brandon's fancy red car parked outside the most expensive restaurant in town. Through the big windows, he could see Brandon and his family sitting at a table, laughing and eating. Brandon's father, Mr. Miller, was wearing an expensive suit and talking to someone who looked important. Marcus thought about his own dinner waiting at home, probably rice and beans again. But he didn't mind. His mom made everything taste good, even when they had little. Just then, something caught his eye. An old man was struggling with some grocery bags near the drugstore. People walked past him, busy with their own lives. The man dropped one of his bags, and oranges rolled across the sidewalk. Without thinking, Marcus ran over to help. "Thank you, young man," the old man said as Marcus gathered the escaped oranges. His voice was kind, and his eyes were bright behind wire-rimmed glasses. Not many people would stop to help these days. "It's no problem, sir," Marcus replied, helping the man pick up his bags. "My mom always says we should help when we can." The old man smiled. "Your mother sounds like a wise woman. I'm Dr. James Thompson. I used to teach at the university before I retired." Marcus's eyes widened. "Thompson, like Mrs. Thompson, the math teacher at Mountain View High." "Ah, you know my daughter. She's mentioned a student named Marcus who has quite a talent for mathematics. Would that be you?" Marcus nodded, surprised that Mrs. Thompson had talked about him to her father. "Well, well," Dr. Thompson chuckled. "What a pleasant coincidence. Sarah tells me you're also quite the basketball player." "You know Sarah, too?" Marcus asked, thinking of his kind classmate. "Indeed. She often joins us for Sunday dinners. In fact," Dr. Thompson paused, looking thoughtful, "why don't you join us this Sunday? We usually have plenty of food, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on that calculus problem." Sarah mentioned you solved differently than anyone else in class. Marcus hesitated. He'd never been invited to a teacher's house before. I wouldn't want to impose, sir. Nonsense. Besides, I have some old mathematics books from my teaching days that might interest you. They're just collecting dust in my study. Before Marcus could respond, a loud voice interrupted them. Well, look who it is. Brandon and his family were leaving the restaurant. Playing servant again, Johnson. Marcus felt his face grow hot, but Dr. Thompson spoke first. Young man, is that how you speak to one of Mountain View's brightest students? Brandon's father, Mr. Miller, stepped forward. Is there a problem here? His voice was smooth but cold. No problem at all, Dr. Thompson replied calmly. I was just inviting Marcus to Sunday dinner to discuss advanced mathematics. He has quite a promising future in academia, you know. Mr. Miller's expression changed slightly. Thompson, aren't you the retired professor who used to head the university's mathematics department? Indeed I am. And I must say, I haven't seen such natural talent for numbers since my teaching days. Dr. Thompson smiled at Marcus. So, shall we say 5 o'clock on Sunday? Marcus found himself nodding, still processing what was happening. Brandon's face had turned an interesting shade of red. As Marcus helped Dr. Thompson put his groceries in his car, he could hear Mr. Miller questioning Brandon about his own math grades. For once, Brandon had nothing to say. Walking home, Marcus felt lighter despite his tired muscles. He thought about how one small act of kindness, stopping to help with dropped oranges, had led to something unexpected. His mom always said that good things come back to those who do good, but Marcus had never really believed it until now. When he got home, his mom was already there, sitting at their small kitchen table with papers spread out in front of her. She looked tired but smiled when she saw him. You're late today, baby, she said, concern in her voice. Marcus told her about practice, about meeting Dr. Thompson, and about the dinner invitation. His mom's eyes got teary, but she was smiling. See, I always told you God works in mysterious ways, she said, hugging him. Now help me look at these community college brochures. Maybe I can take some business classes at night.